The morning of January 20th, 1953, arrived cold and gray in Washington. At precisely 8:45 a.m., a black limousine idled outside the White House's north entrance. Inside sat President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower, motionless, arms crossed. The temperature hovered around 49 degrees. Clouds blanketed the sky. Behind the windows of the executive mansion, President Harry Truman stood watching, waiting for movement that never came. Eisenhower had decided he would not step into that building. He would not share coffee with the Trumans. He would not honor the customs that had governed presidential transitions for generations. Instead, he would remain seated in that automobile and force Truman to come outside, to come to him. This was no accident. This was no confusion about timing. This was a deliberate insult, delivered on what should have represented American democracy's finest moment, the orderly passage of authority from one leader to another. Consider who sat in that vehicle. Dwight Eisenhower, 62 years old, the supreme commander who had orchestrated Allied victory across Europe. The general who had accepted Germany's surrender. The military mind that had coordinated millions of troops spanning 2 continents. Monarchs and heads of state had sought his wisdom. The American electorate had just handed him a crushing victory. 55% of votes cast, 442 electoral college votes. Yet this man would not walk 20 feet to greet the president who had offered him nearly everything. Inside the White House stood Harry Truman, 68 years old. Farm boy turned businessman, county official, senator, vice president, president. The man who had authorized atomic weapons. The leader who had confronted Stalin directly. The architect of the Marshall Plan that reconstructed Europe. The president who had desegregated the military. The commander who had dismissed Douglas MacArthur. The statesman who had held the Western Alliance together through the Cold War's terrifying early years. 7 years earlier, this same Harry Truman had offered to make Dwight Eisenhower president on the Democratic ticket, with Truman himself stepping down to serve as vice president. Eisenhower had declined. Politics held no interest for him, he'd insisted. He was a military man, not a politician. His duty lay in uniform, not in electoral office. Then 1952 arrived. Eisenhower declared his candidacy for president as a Republican, against Truman's party, against Truman's record, against everything Truman had constructed during 7 difficult years. Now he sat outside that building, compelling the sitting president to approach him like a servant called to the curb. CBS journalist Eric Sevareid witnessed the scene. His 3-word description captured everything. It was shocking. J.B. West, the White House's chief usher, observed it too. "I was glad I wasn't in that car," he said later. The relationship between these men had not always been fractured. They had once been allies. Truman had once proclaimed Eisenhower the greatest military strategist of his generation. Eisenhower had once written to Truman with genuine appreciation and respect. But something had changed. Something had shattered beyond any possibility of repair. On this frozen January morning, that rupture became visible to the entire nation. The break hadn't occurred overnight. It had developed gradually across months and years, through a succession of decisions and betrayals and political calculations that transformed mutual regard into something approaching hatred. The first fracture appeared in July 1945 on Germany's Autobahn outside Potsdam. President Truman, newly elevated after Franklin Roosevelt's death, met with General Eisenhower, the hero who had commanded D-Day. They rode together through Berlin's devastation. Truman studied the young general beside him and glimpsed America's future leadership. He turned to Eisenhower with an extraordinary statement. "General, there is nothing you may want that I won't try to help you get." That included, Truman made clear, the presidency itself in 1948. This wasn't casual conversation. Truman meant every word. He had served as vice president for merely 82 days when Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. He had inherited a war still raging on 2 fronts, secret atomic research he hadn't known existed, and relationships with Allied leaders he had never encountered. He felt unprepared. He admired military leadership. Eisenhower embodied everything America wanted in a leader at that moment. competence, victory, moral authority earned through real achievement. Eisenhower thanked him and declined. He harbored no political aspirations. He was a soldier. He would remain a soldier. He had devoted his entire adult existence to the Army. He understood military command. Politics seemed like foreign territory, where rules remained unclear and enemies proved harder to identify. Truman accepted that response. He respected it. Over the following years, Truman and Eisenhower collaborated frequently. The relationship rested on mutual necessity. Truman needed capable military leadership as he navigated the Cold War's beginning. Eisenhower needed political backing as he transitioned from wartime command to peacetime military administration. Truman appointed Eisenhower as Army Chief of Staff in November 1945. Across subsequent years, he awarded Eisenhower the Distinguished Service Medal 3 separate times, 1945, 1948, and 1952. When NATO was created in 1949, Truman called on Eisenhower to serve as its inaugural Supreme Commander in 1951. They exchanged cordial letters. They met for official business and ceremonies. The relationship wasn't intimate or personal, but it was professional, respectful, productive. Then 1947 brought something remarkable. Truman extended the offer again, this time in his private diary. On July 25, 1947, Truman wrote about a conversation with Eisenhower at 3:30 that afternoon. They discussed Douglas MacArthur possibly returning from Japan to seek the Republican nomination. MacArthur was another towering military figure, but one Truman deeply distrusted. MacArthur displayed autocratic tendencies. He had governed Japan like an emperor. Truman worried about what MacArthur might do with presidential authority. Truman's solution was audacious. He proposed that if MacArthur ran as a Republican, Eisenhower should announce for the Democratic nomination. Truman wrote that he would gladly step aside and run as Eisenhower's vice president. He added, "I like the Senate anyway. Ike and I could be elected and my family and myself would be happy outside this great white jail known as the White House." He concluded the diary entry with a note, "Ike won't quote me and I won't quote him." This wasn't fantasy. This was the sitting President of the United States offering to demote himself to Vice President to place Eisenhower in the White House. It revealed how little confidence Truman possessed in his own political future at that moment. It also revealed how deeply he valued Eisenhower's leadership and believed in his character. Eisenhower declined again. He still had no interest in politics. He was serving as president of Columbia University at the time, having departed active military command. He wanted to remain in education or return to military service if needed, but he did not want to enter the political arena. Secretary of the Army Kenneth Royal approached Eisenhower later that year with the identical offer. Truman had asked Royal to try once more. Truman wanted Royal to make clear this wasn't merely a passing thought. This was a genuine offer. Eisenhower could have the Democratic nomination. The party would support him. Truman would campaign for him. They would win. Eisenhower declined again. In February 1948, Truman awarded Eisenhower his 4th Distinguished Service Medal in a White House ceremony. The two men stood together for photographs. They smiled. The images show no trace of the animosity that would emerge later. Eisenhower wore his dress uniform with all his decorations and ribbons. Truman looked proud standing beside him. Newspaper captions described them as close colleagues working together to secure America's future. That same year, Truman faced the worst political crisis of his presidency to that point. His approval ratings had collapsed. The Democratic Party was fragmenting. Henry Wallace was running as a progressive, drawing votes from the left. Strom Thurmond was running as a Dixiecrat, pulling votes from the South. Republicans controlled both congressional chambers. Everyone predicted Truman would lose catastrophically to Republican nominee Thomas Dewey. Truman ran anyway. Against all predictions, against disastrous poll numbers, against a divided Democratic Party, Truman won. It was among the greatest upsets in American political history. He won without Eisenhower. He won on his own terms. But Eisenhower's refusals had planted something in Truman's mind. A question. If Eisenhower had no interest in politics, why did people keep approaching him? And if he truly wasn't interested, why did he keep declining in ways that left possibilities slightly open? The answer arrived in 1952. Eisenhower announced he would seek the Republican nomination for president. The announcement shocked many people. It shocked Truman most profoundly. For 5 years, Eisenhower had insisted he had no interest in politics. He had rejected multiple offers to run as a Democrat. He had turned down the opportunity to become president without campaigning for it. Now, he was entering politics anyway, but as a Republican running against the party that had supported him throughout his career. Truman felt personally betrayed. He had offered Eisenhower the presidency twice. He had been willing to step aside, to make himself vice president, to hand over power to a man he believed in. Eisenhower had said no, claiming he didn't want it. Now, Eisenhower wanted it. He just didn't want it from Truman or the Democrats. But that wasn't what shattered the relationship. Political differences could be managed. Eisenhower believed in different economic policies, different approaches to government. Those were honest disagreements. Truman could accept that. What Truman could not accept, what broke the relationship beyond repair, was what happened during the campaign. The issue was George Catlett Marshall. Marshall was born in Pennsylvania in 1880. He graduated from the Virginia Military Institute in 1901. He served in the Philippines, in France during World War I, in China between the wars. He was methodical, disciplined, brilliant at organization and logistics. He understood how to build armies, how to coordinate operations across continents, how to select leaders who could execute complex plans under impossible pressure. When World War II began, Marshall was Army Chief of Staff. He held that position from 1939 to 1945. During those 6 years, he transformed the United States Army from a force of fewer than 200,000 men into a military machine of over 8 million. He selected the commanders. He approved the battle plans. He allocated resources. He made the system function. And he made Dwight Eisenhower's career possible. In 1941, Eisenhower was a lieutenant colonel unknown outside military circles. Marshall saw something in him. He promoted Eisenhower rapidly, advancing him over hundreds of more senior officers. By 1942, Eisenhower was commanding Allied forces in North Africa. By 1943, Marshall recommended Eisenhower to lead Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of France. Marshall had wanted that command for himself. It was the most important military operation of the war, possibly of the century. But President Roosevelt asked Marshall to remain in Washington to continue managing the global war effort. Marshall agreed and gave the command to Eisenhower instead. He could have resented Eisenhower for receiving the glory while Marshall stayed behind doing staff work. But Marshall never displayed any resentment. He supported Eisenhower completely. Winston Churchill called Marshall the organizer of victory. Historians credit Marshall with creating the military force that won World War II. Without Marshall's organizational genius, without his ability to construct and manage a global military effort, the war might have ended very differently. After the war, Marshall attempted to retire. He was 65 years old. He had served his country for more than 4 decades. He wanted to rest. But in 1947, President Truman asked him to serve as Secretary of State. Marshall agreed. From 1947 to 1949, Marshall served as America's chief diplomat during the critical early years of the Cold War. It was Marshall who articulated the principles of the European Recovery Program in a speech at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. The program became known as the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States provided over $13 billion in economic assistance to help rebuild Western European economies. The program worked. It rebuilt infrastructure, stabilized currencies, restored trade, and created the economic foundation for decades of prosperity. In 1953, Marshall was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for this work, the only career military officer ever to receive that honor. After serving as Secretary of State, Marshall retired again. But in 1950, when the Korean War began, Truman called on him one final time. Marshall became Secretary of Defense, serving from September 1950 to September 1951. He worked to rebuild American military strength after post-war demobilization had weakened it. He oversaw the military response to Korea. He helped create NATO's command structure. So when Senator Joseph McCarthy attacked Marshall, he wasn't attacking merely another government official. He was attacking one of the architects of Allied victory, one of the creators of the post-war order, one of the most respected figures in American public life. And he was attacking Dwight Eisenhower's mentor, patron, and friend. Marshall had promoted Eisenhower over hundreds of more senior officers. Marshall had recommended Eisenhower to lead the D-Day invasion. Marshall had made Eisenhower's career possible. Eisenhower owed Marshall everything. In 1950 and 1951, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin began attacking Marshall. McCarthy was riding high on anti-communist hysteria. He had made a career from accusing people of being communist sympathizers. Most of his accusations were baseless. Many were cruel. Some destroyed innocent lives. But they were politically effective in an America terrified of Soviet expansion. McCarthy accused Marshall of being part of a communist conspiracy. In a speech on the Senate floor in June 1951, McCarthy spent 60,000 words attacking Marshall. He called Marshall's career a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. He accused Marshall of losing China to communism. He accused Marshall of undermining American interests in Europe and Asia. He suggested Marshall was actively working to advance communist goals. These accusations were insane. Marshall had spent his entire adult life serving the United States. He had built the army that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. He had created the Marshall Plan that stopped communist expansion in Europe. He had served as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War, fighting against communist aggression. The idea that Marshall was secretly working for the communists was grotesque, absurd, and beneath contempt. Senator William Jenner of Indiana went even further than McCarthy. He called Marshall a living lie and a frontman for traitors. He said Marshall was joining hands once more with this criminal crowd of traitors and communist appeasers. These were not policy disagreements. These were personal attacks on Marshall's character, his loyalty, his integrity. Everyone who knew Marshall understood the attacks were false. But they were politically useful for Republicans trying to paint the Truman administration as soft on communism. Truman was enraged by the attacks on Marshall. He called Marshall the greatest living American. The attacks on Marshall felt personal to Truman because they were attacks on his judgment, his administration, his presidency. And Truman expected Eisenhower to defend Marshall. Eisenhower owed Marshall his career. If anyone should stand up for Marshall against McCarthy's smears, it should be Eisenhower. In October 1952, during the presidential campaign, Eisenhower was scheduled to give a speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state. McCarthy would be on the stage with him. McCarthy had already endorsed Eisenhower. Republican leaders in Wisconsin wanted a show of unity. They wanted Eisenhower and McCarthy standing together, presenting a united front against the Democrats. Eisenhower's staff prepared a speech that included a paragraph defending Marshall. The paragraph was short but clear. I know that charges of disloyalty have been leveled against General Marshall. I have been privileged for 35 years to know General Marshall personally. I know him as a man and as a soldier, to be dedicated with singular selflessness and the profoundest patriotism to the service of America. The paragraph was in the prepared text. It was released to reporters in advance. The press knew what was coming. Political observers anticipated a dramatic moment. Eisenhower, the war hero, standing in McCarthy's home state, defending his mentor against McCarthy's attacks. It would be a powerful statement about character, about loyalty, about standing up for what was right even when politically costly. But then Wisconsin Governor Walter Kohler Jr. and members of Eisenhower's campaign staff urged him to remove the paragraph. They argued it would offend McCarthy. It would offend Wisconsin Republicans. It would create unnecessary controversy. It would make the evening about Marshall and McCarthy instead of about Eisenhower's vision for America. They said it wasn't worth the political cost. Wisconsin was an important state. McCarthy was popular there. Eisenhower needed Wisconsin's electoral votes. Why pick a fight over something that wouldn't change any votes? Eisenhower listened to his advisors. He understood their reasoning. He knew they were trying to help him win. And he wanted to win. He believed he could do great things as president. He believed he could end the Korean War, manage the Cold War better than Truman had, bring competent administration to a government he saw as bloated and inefficient. To do those things, he needed to win the election. To win the election, he needed Wisconsin. So Eisenhower agreed. He deleted the paragraph. He made the calculation that winning was more important than defending Marshall. He told himself he could defend Marshall later, after the election, when the political pressure wasn't so intense. He convinced himself this one compromise wouldn't matter in the long run. On October 3, 1952, Dwight Eisenhower stood on a stage in the Milwaukee Arena before 10,000 people with Senator Joseph McCarthy standing beside him. The arena was packed. The crowd was enthusiastic. They cheered when Eisenhower appeared. They cheered louder when McCarthy joined him on stage. Eisenhower delivered his speech. He praised McCarthy's anti-communist efforts. He talked about the need to root out subversion in government. He endorsed McCarthy's crusade. He said nothing about George Marshall. Not one word. He didn't defend him. He didn't mention him. He acted as if Marshall didn't exist. After the speech, McCarthy approached Eisenhower. The photographers were ready. McCarthy reached out his hand. Eisenhower saw it coming. He tried to step back, tried to avoid the handshake, but there were people behind him blocking his path. McCarthy was too quick. He grabbed Eisenhower's hand and held it high in the air like a referee raising the hand of a victorious boxer. The cameras flashed. The photograph went out across the country. Dwight Eisenhower, hero of D-Day, shaking hands with the man who had called his mentor a traitor. The news coverage was brutal. The paragraph defending Marshall had been in the advance text. Reporters knew Eisenhower had planned to defend Marshall and then chose not to. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a scheduling conflict. This was a deliberate choice. Eisenhower had weighed defending his mentor against winning Wisconsin. Wisconsin had won. The New York Times ran a front-page story. The Washington Post published an editorial. Columnists across the political spectrum condemned the decision. Even some Republicans were disgusted. One Republican newspaper editor wrote that Eisenhower had sold his soul for a mess of pottage. Truman's reaction was immediate and blunt. He told reporters, "I had never thought the man who is now the Republican candidate would stoop so low." He elaborated in later speeches. He called it one of the most shocking things in the history of this country. He said, "The trouble with Eisenhower, he's just a coward. He ought to be ashamed for what he did." Truman didn't stop there. He made defending Marshall a central theme of his campaign appearances. He reminded audiences that Marshall had been Eisenhower's boss, his mentor, the man who had made Eisenhower's career possible. He asked how anyone could trust Eisenhower to stand up to the Soviets if he couldn't even stand up to Joe McCarthy. He questioned Eisenhower's character, his judgment, his fitness for the presidency. Eisenhower knew what Truman was saying. He read the newspapers. He heard the criticism. And instead of accepting it as the price of his political choice, he became angry. He felt Truman's attacks were unfair, partisan, personal. He believed Truman was using Marshall as a political weapon. He convinced himself that Truman didn't actually care about Marshall, that this was just campaign rhetoric designed to damage Eisenhower's reputation. But Truman did care about Marshall. Marshall had been Truman's Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. Marshall had been one of Truman's most trusted advisors. Truman called Marshall the greatest living American. For Truman, loyalty mattered. Character mattered. Standing up for the people who had stood up for you mattered. And Eisenhower had failed that test in the most public way possible. There was more. 2 weeks before the Milwaukee speech, Eisenhower had campaigned in Indianapolis with Senator William Jenner. Jenner was the man who had called Marshall a front man for traitors and accused him of joining hands with a criminal crowd of traitors and communist appeasers. Jenner represented everything ugly about the anti-communist hysteria of the early 1950s, the willingness to destroy reputations, to make baseless accusations, to use fear as a political weapon. Eisenhower knew what Jenner had said about Marshall. Everyone knew. It was public record. But Eisenhower needed Indiana. Jenner was powerful in the state Republican Party. Eisenhower's advisors told him he had to appear with Jenner, had to accept his endorsement, had to stand on the same platform and smile for the cameras. So Eisenhower did it. He appeared on stage with Jenner. He let Jenner embrace him. He smiled. The photographers captured the image. Eisenhower and Jenner, arms around each other, united against the Democrats. Eisenhower later told aides he felt dirty after the event. But he did it anyway. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself he could wash off the stain after the election. He told himself that winning justified these compromises. But for Truman, this was worse than Milwaukee. At least in Milwaukee, Eisenhower had originally planned to defend Marshall and then back down under pressure. In Indianapolis, Eisenhower never even tried. He just accepted Jenner's support, accepted his endorsement, stood beside him as if nothing was wrong. To Truman, this pattern revealed something fundamental about Eisenhower's character. Eisenhower was willing to stand with men who slandered George Marshall, the man who had made Eisenhower's career possible, because it was politically convenient. Eisenhower would sacrifice principle for votes. He would abandon loyalty for electoral advantage. He would compromise his own stated values if it helped him win. And if Eisenhower would do that to George Marshall, what would he do as president? If he couldn't stand up to McCarthy and Jenner during a campaign, how could he stand up to the Soviets in the White House? If political pressure could make him abandon his mentor, what else would political pressure make him abandon? These were the questions Truman asked in his campaign speeches. These were the doubts he tried to plant in voters' minds. He made the campaign personal because, for him, it was personal. This wasn't just about policy differences. This was about character. This was about whether Dwight Eisenhower was the man Truman had once believed him to be. The campaign grew worse from there. Eisenhower pledged to go to Korea if elected, implying he could end the war that Truman had been unable to finish. Truman called this demagoguery, a cheap campaign trick. Republican campaign surrogates attacked Truman's administration as soft on communism, corrupt, and incompetent. Truman responded by calling Eisenhower a stooge for Wall Street and a puppet of Republican reactionaries. By Election Day, the personal animosity between the two men was impossible to hide. Eisenhower won in a landslide. He took 55% of the popular vote. He won 442 electoral votes to Adlai Stevenson's 89. He even broke the Democratic hold on parts of the South, winning Virginia, Florida, Tennessee, and Texas. After the election, Eisenhower and Truman met once, on November 18, 1952, for a transition briefing at the White House. Both men approached the meeting with dread. They had spent the previous 3 months attacking each other. They had said things that could not be unsaid. They had developed a mutual contempt that made ordinary conversation difficult. The meeting was held in the Oval Office. Truman sat behind the resolute desk. Eisenhower sat across from him. The atmosphere was stiff, formal, awkward, and unrewarding, according to biographer Stephen Ambrose. Neither man wanted to be there. Both felt obligated by duty and tradition. Truman tried to brief Eisenhower on how the White House actually worked. He explained the staff structure. He described how information flowed to the president. He outlined the daily schedule, the decision-making process, the way cabinet meetings were conducted. He tried to share practical wisdom earned through nearly 8 years in the highest office. Eisenhower listened with visible impatience. He had been a 5-star general. He had commanded millions of men. He had coordinated operations across multiple continents. He didn't need Harry Truman, a former haberdasher from Missouri, to tell him how to run an organization. Truman moved on to foreign policy. He talked about Soviet intentions, about the situation in Korea, about relationships with European allies. He tried to explain the delicate balance of containment strategy, the importance of economic aid to strengthen allies, the need for military strength combined with diplomatic flexibility. Again, Eisenhower seemed uninterested. He had been Supreme Commander of NATO. He knew European leaders personally. He understood military strategy better than Truman ever would. He didn't need a lecture on foreign policy from a man whose administration had been unable to win the Korean War. Finally, Truman discussed the budget process. He explained how the executive budget was prepared, how it had to be submitted to Congress, how the appropriations process worked. This was technical procedural information that would be essential for managing the government. Eisenhower later wrote that the meeting added little to my knowledge, nor did it affect my planning for the new administration. He felt Truman had wasted his time with obvious information and partisan spin. He thought Truman was trying to defend his own record rather than actually help with the transition. Truman felt the meeting was a waste of time for different reasons. Eisenhower, he thought, wasn't listening. Everything Truman said went in one ear and out the other. Eisenhower sat there with the confidence of a man who believed he already knew everything important. He didn't ask substantive questions. He didn't take notes. He just waited for the meeting to end so he could leave and do things his own way. After Eisenhower left, Truman told his staff that Eisenhower would struggle with the presidency. "He'll sit right here," Truman said, pointing to the desk, "and he'll say, 'Do this, do that,' and nothing will happen. Poor Ike. It won't be a bit like the Army. He'll find it very frustrating." Truman was predicting that Eisenhower would fail to understand the difference between military command and presidential leadership. In the military, orders were orders. You gave a command and it was executed. In government, everything was negotiation. You had to persuade Congress, convince the public, build coalitions, compromise with rivals. Truman thought Eisenhower lacked the political skills to succeed. Between the election and the inauguration, Eisenhower made decisions that seemed designed to irritate Truman. He decided to wear a Homburg hat to the inauguration instead of the traditional silk top hat. He didn't consult Truman about this. He just did it. It was a small thing, but it felt like a deliberate break from tradition, a way of saying he would do things his own way. By Inauguration Day, the tension between the two men was visible to everyone who saw them. Clark Clifford, a White House advisor, said the hatred between the two men that day was like a monsoon. Eisenhower told associates he wasn't sure if he could stand sitting next to that guy for the ride to the Capitol. He made it clear he resented having to share a car with Truman, resented having to pretend they were friendly, resented the entire ceremony of transition. And so Eisenhower made his decision. He would not enter the White House. He would not have coffee with Harry and Bess Truman. He would not follow the tradition of the president-elect coming inside to escort the outgoing president to the car. He would stay in the limousine and make Truman come to him. Mamie Eisenhower sat beside her husband in the car. She knew what he was doing. She said nothing. She waited. Inside the White House, Truman knew what was happening. He saw the car sitting outside. He knew Eisenhower wasn't coming in. For a moment, it seemed like Truman might refuse to go outside. It seemed like the inauguration might not happen because two stubborn men couldn't agree on who would walk through a door first. But Truman was still the president. He had a responsibility to the country and to the office. He swallowed his anger and walked outside. The photographers captured the moment. Truman emerged from the north portico. He walked to the car. Eisenhower did not get out. Truman opened the door and climbed into the back seat. The two men sat beside each other. They did not look at each other. They did not speak. The car began the drive to the Capitol. The silence in the car was heavy. Both men stared straight ahead. Mamie Eisenhower tried to make small talk. She commented on the weather. She mentioned the crowds lining the streets. At some point during the drive, Eisenhower broke the silence. He asked Truman a question. Who had ordered his son John back from Korea for the inauguration? John Eisenhower was 29 years old, a major in the United States Army. serving with combat units in Korea. The war was still being fought. American soldiers were dying. John was doing his duty, serving in a dangerous place, leading men under fire. Someone had issued orders pulling John out of Korea and sending him back to Washington for the inauguration. Eisenhower wanted to know who had that authority, who had made that decision without consulting him. Truman looked at Eisenhower and said, "I did." He paused, then explained, "The president thought it was right and proper for your son to witness the swearing in of his father to the presidency." It was a generous gesture. Truman understood what the moment meant. A father becoming president while his son served in a war zone, the historic nature of the occasion, the family significance. Truman had used his authority as commander-in-chief to make sure John Eisenhower could be there to see his father take the oath of office. Truman didn't ask for credit. He didn't announce it publicly. He didn't use it as a campaign talking point. He just did it because he thought it was right. Because despite his anger at Eisenhower, despite the bitterness of the campaign, despite everything that had gone wrong between them, Truman still believed some things mattered more than politics. Family mattered. Historic moments mattered. Doing the decent thing mattered. Eisenhower said nothing in response. No thank you. No acknowledgement of the gesture. No recognition of what Truman had done. He just turned back to looking out the window, watching the crowds lining Pennsylvania Avenue. They arrived at the Capitol. The ceremony began. Chief Justice Fred Vinson administered the oath of office. Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States. Truman stood nearby and listened. When the ceremony ended, he left. He did not attend the inaugural parade. He went to Union Station, where at least 5,000 people had gathered to see him off. They cheered for him. They shouted his name. The police had to form a flying wedge to get the Trumans to their train. Harry Truman boarded the train to Independence, Missouri. He left Washington after nearly 8 years as president. He would not return to the White House for 10 years. For 8 years, from 1953 to 1961, Truman never set foot in the White House. Eisenhower sent 3 invitations during that time. Truman declined each one. Truman felt the invitations were insincere, pro forma gestures designed to create the appearance of reconciliation without any real intent. Eisenhower felt Truman was being petty and unreasonable. The two men lived in a state of frozen hostility. They did not speak. They did not correspond. Then in October 1959, George Marshall died. Marshall passed away at Walter Reed Hospital on October 16, 1959. His funeral was held on October 20th at the Fort Myer Chapel in Virginia. President Eisenhower attended. Former President Truman attended. They sat in the same pew, side by side, for the first time since Inauguration Day 1953. Neither man spoke to the other during the service. They sat in silence, mourning the man who had meant so much to both of them. After the service, they went their separate ways. No handshake, no words, just the shared presence at a funeral for a mutual friend. Over the next 4 years, Truman and Eisenhower saw each other occasionally at other funerals. Fred Vinson, the Chief Justice who had administered Eisenhower's oath of office, died. They attended his funeral. Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, died. They attended that funeral. Eleanor Roosevelt died. They were both there. Each time, they maintained their distance. They were civil but cold. They acknowledged each other's presence but did not engage. Then, in November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation went into mourning. Former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower both came to Washington for the funeral. Kennedy's body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Thousands of Americans filed past the casket. Foreign leaders arrived from around the world. On November 25, 1963, the funeral procession moved from the Capitol to St. Matthew's Cathedral, then to Arlington National Cemetery. Truman and Eisenhower rode in the same car to the cemetery. Margaret Truman and Mamie Eisenhower rode with them. During the drive, they talked. They discussed whether Kennedy's assassination was the work of a conspiracy or a lone gunman. They agreed it was most likely a lone gunman. They talked about the state of the world, about the challenges facing the country. After the graveside service, Margaret Truman invited the Eisenhowers to join her father for lunch at Blair House, where the Trumans were staying. The Eisenhowers accepted. Sandwiches were served. Coffee was poured. For an hour, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower sat together and talked. They reminisced about old battles, political and otherwise. They talked like two old men who had once known each other well and were remembering what that had felt like. Admiral Dennison, who was present, later recalled, "I thought it would never end, but it was really heartwarming. You'd think there had never been any differences between them. It was really wonderful." When it was time for Eisenhower to leave, Truman and Margaret walked the Eisenhowers to their car. The two former presidents stood on the sidewalk and talked for a few more minutes. Then they shook hands. It was a long, lingering, silent handshake. Margaret kissed Eisenhower on the cheek. Mamie kissed Truman. 10 years after that cold January morning in 1953, they had finally found their way back to something resembling friendship. They met one more time in Kansas City in 1966 at a United Nations luncheon. Eisenhower's brother Milton sat with them. He observed that all the old animosities were forgotten and that they had quite a good time together. Dwight David Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, at the age of 78. He had served 2 full terms as president. He had overseen the construction of the interstate highway system. He had ended the Korean War. He had managed the early years of the Cold War. His presidency had lasting effects on American infrastructure, foreign policy, and domestic politics. Harry S. Truman died on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. He had returned to Independence, Missouri, in 1953 and lived there for nearly 20 years. He built his presidential library. He wrote his memoirs. He took daily walks around town. He remained politically active, supporting Democratic candidates and speaking out on issues he cared about. The story of what happened on January 20th, 1953 became part of American political lore. The image of Eisenhower refusing to enter the White House, of Truman walking out to the car, of two great men unable to set aside their anger for even a few hours, became a symbol of how personal grievances can poison public duty. The refusal to enter the White House was not about protocol or scheduling. It was about betrayal. Eisenhower felt betrayed by Truman's campaign attacks, by the accusations of moral cowardice, by the partisan criticism that questioned his character. Truman felt betrayed by Eisenhower's refusal to defend George Marshall, by his willingness to stand with McCarthy and Jenner, by his abandonment of the principles Truman believed they shared. Both men had legitimate grievances. Both men also let those grievances override their responsibility to the moment. The inauguration of a president is not about the two men in the car. It is about the continuity of democratic government, about the peaceful transfer of power, about showing the country and the world that America's institutions are stronger than any individual's pride. Eisenhower forgot that when he refused to walk through the door. Truman remembered it when he walked out anyway. The handshake at Blair House in 1963, 10 years later, suggests that both men eventually understood what they had lost. The friendship they might have had, the collaboration they might have achieved, the mutual respect they had once shared. But understanding comes too late to change what happened. On that cold January morning in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower sat in a car and refused to enter Harry Truman's White House. The moment passed. The insult landed. The damage was done. And for 10 years, two of the most important Americans of the 20th century stayed apart, divided by pride, anger, and the memory of a threshold neither man would cross.